Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Chol HaMoed. We'll be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Dalet Amud Beis. We're holding in the middle of Siman Tuf Kuf Lamed Gimel, which discusses melachah HaTorah b'Chol HaMoed, various types of melachah that you may perform on Chol HaMoed. And we pick up today on the very last word of Dalet Amud Aleph, with Siman Tuf Kuf Lamed Gimel Sif Beis. Says the Mechaber, Mutter, and now we turn to Dalet Amud Beis, Mutter la'akar pishton. You are allowed to uproot flax. You're allowed to pull flax out of the ground, even though this would be actually performing two melachas on Chol HaMoed. It would be the melachah of kotzer, the melachah of harvesting. It's also by uprooting it, by pulling it out of the ground, you're softening up the ground, which is also the melachah of chayrish. It's maybe a tilde of chayrish. It's chayfer. It's digging. It might be chayrish. It might be baina. But whatever it is, it's a secondary malacha. There's one malacha that you're uprooting and you're harvesting the flax. The other malacha is that you're doing a malacha to the ground. But you're allowed to do this on Chol HaMoed. Why, says the Mechaber? Mipnei shero'i lechasois by es ha'achlim. Because the flax has a purpose. When you uproot the flax from the ground, you are then going to use these stalks of flax, you're going to use them to cover peros, produce, or fruit, or literally fruit, that's drying out in the field or on the rooftops. Let's take a look right away at the Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Yud Aleph, here on Dalet Amud Beis. Says the Chavetz Chaim, what kind of oichlim is the Mechaber talking about? The Mechaber says that you could use this flax to cover food. Explains the Chavetz Chaim, Kigoin te'enim u'tumarim, for instance, if we have figs and dates, hamiyavshen oisan b'chama, if you're laying them out to dry them in the sun, u'tzrichin lachasoisan balayla, at night you need to cover them up, mipnei hatal, or they will get ruined from the moisture of the dew. Excuse me. So you have these figs and these dates. You lay them out in the sun to dry them. So during the day you want them out and exposed to the sun. But overnight you need to cover them so the dew doesn't fall on them and moisten them. And therefore you're allowed to uproot the flax in order to use it for this purpose. And the Rishonim, this is quoted from a Gemara in Moed Katan. And the Rishonim, Rashi, and the Ran in Moed Katan say that, Rashi says it beferish actually. I shouldn't put words into the mouth of the Ran, chas v'shalom. Rashi says that this is Tzarech HaMoed. So it seems from Rashi that the reason this is mutter is because you're going to use these figs and these dates on Yom Tov. So whatever malacha you're doing for these figs and dates are Tzarech HaMoed. And it's not just a tzarech hamoed, it's also like a tzarech oichel nefesh. It's a tzarech for your food on the moed. So you're allowed to do these malachas to protect the fruit and cover up the fruit. I'm also wondering, even if it's not a tzarech hamoed, even if you're not going to eat the figs and the dates on Yom Tov itself, maybe you still would be allowed to do it because it's a davar ha'avud. If you have these fruits and if they're going to get ruined by the dew falling onto them, so then I would assume that it's a davar ha'avud. Right? And if it's a davar ha'avud, and you're doing a melachah gemura, kotzer is a melachah gemura. Yeah, you're allowed to do a melachah gemura, as long as it's not a maisa uman, you're allowed to do a melachah gemura for a davar ha'avud, unless it's a davar sheyesh by tercha harbe. If this is considered something that has great tercha, then you wouldn't be allowed to do it for a davar ha'avud either. But in any case, that's not what the Rishonim say here. The Rishonim don't say that you're doing this because it's a davar ha'avud. The Rishonim say you're covering up these fruits because it's a tzarech hamoed. So the implication is that you're going to be using the fruits on Yom Tov, and therefore you're allowed to do this on Chol HaMoed. Let's go weiter in the Mishnah Berurah over here in Ois Katan Yud Aleph. Of course, when the Mechaber says you're allowed to uproot the flax, it's only if you're doing it for this purpose. Va'afilu bazeh, and even if you are doing it for this purpose, lo yishari leilakar ela b'chtei mashu tzarich. You're only allowed to uproot what you actually need and what you're actually going to use. So this is not a blanket heter that the mechaber is giving you. He's not saying you could go out into the field and harvest your flax on Chol HaMoed because theoretically you might need it to go ahead and cover fruits that are drying. No, the heter is if you have fruits that are drying and you need something to cover them with, then you're allowed to go out and harvest whatever flax you need in order to use it to go ahead and cover up your fruits. V'hu adin, continues the Mishnah Berurah, the same halacha applies. Imhu tzarech lezera hapishtan letzarech chafifa. There's another possible use of the flax, and that is that they would harvest the flax and they would take out the flax seed. Sheshorin oisai v'anoshim chayfefos by lahachlik bisaran uletachzeach mar'ehen. Women would use the flax seed for cosmetics. So you're allowed to go harvest the flax, take out the flax seeds, soak the flax seeds, and then use it for these cosmetic purposes. Literally what the Chavetz Chaim says over here is that the women would use it lahachlik bisaran to make their skin smooth, uletachzeach mar'ehen, and to give them a glow. So this is some kind of cosmetic purposes. The shari lakar pishtan b'shvil zeh. You're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to harvest the pishtan for this purpose as well. And the truth is, this is a halacha that we're going to have beferish later on in Siman Tov Kuf Mem Vav in Sif Hey, where the mechaber is going to say a woman is allowed to do any melachah for her tachshitin, anything that she needs for her cosmetics to beautify herself. That is something that's also allowed to be done on Chol HaMoed. The mechaber says, "Oisa isha kol tachshiteha b'moed." A woman is allowed to prepare all of her cosmetics, and she's allowed to apply all of her cosmetics on Chol HaMoed. And the Bir Halacha says over there, it's on Daf Yutes Amud Aleph, if you want to see it inside, in Dibur HaMaskil kol tachshiteha b'moed. The Chavetz Chaim says in the Bir Halacha, Shezet tzarech hagufhu. This is for the purposes of the body. The body derives benefit from this. Uke'ein oichel nefesh. And therefore, this is considered melachah that you're doing litzarech oichel nefesh on Chol HaMoed. Ulefikach oiseh kedarka b'lo shinoi ubetercha rabba. And therefore, the Chavetz Chaim brings down from the Ritva that you're allowed to do this on Chol HaMoed without any kind of shinoi. You don't have to do it in any kind of strange way. And even if it's a tircha meruba, you're allowed to do this on Chol HaMoed. Continues the Chavetz Chaim in the Mishnah Berurah here, Ois Katan Yod Aleph, right by the Ois Katan Chaf for the Sharet Tzion. Va'af al gav de b'shvil zeh loy hayo loy litloish rak roish hagivol. The Chavetz Chaim points out that we gave now two reasons why you're allowed to harvest the flax on Chol HaMoed. One is you're going to use the entire stalk. You're going to lay out the stalks over the figs and the dates that are drying to cover them. But the second potential use why it would be mutter to go ahead and harvest the flax is if you need the flax seed for cosmetics. But in that case, you only need the flax seed. You don't need the entire stalk. In that case, wonders the Chavetz Chaim, why is it mutter to uproot the whole stalk? Why not just cut off the tip of the stalk where the flax seed is, extract the flax seed, and prepare the cosmetics? Now, what's the mile of that? The mile is because, like I told you, uprooting the entire stalk is the performance of two melachas. That's kotzer and also chayfer. It's also digging, because you're uprooting the soil. But if you just take off the tip of the stalk and extract the flax seed, that's only one melachah. That's only the melachah of kotzer. So in this second case where you need it just for the flax seed, you would think it might be usher to uproot the entire stalk. Yet, says the Chavetz Chaim, no. You're allowed to uproot the whole stalk. Although you might think that for the purposes of cosmetics, there's no reason to uproot the whole stalk, you should just take off the tip, still you're allowed to uproot the stalk. Why? The Chachamim were not matriach you to do this in a different way than it's normally done. V'shari lakar im hashoirish. And you're allowed to pull it up together with the roots. So basically, what the Chofetz Chaim is telling me over here is, since you do have a valid Chol HaMoed that allows you to go ahead and get the flaxseed, so you're allowed to harvest the flaxseed in the normal way. You're not mechuyev to make yourself meshuggah and take out a scissor and go cutting off the tips of all the stalks. You could go harvest it the way you always do, because you have a valid need for it, l'tzarech hamayid, to use it for the cosmetics. But the Chofetz Chaim does point out the gam bazeh eine mutter ele b'chtei tzarchai. However, in this second case also, you're only allowed to harvest what you need. You're not allowed to go do your whole flax harvest because your wife needs a few ounces of flax seeds for her cosmetics. You're allowed to go get what you need. Of course, it's like we said earlier in the Siman, you're not mechuyev to be mitzamtzim. You don't have to ask your wife precisely, you need the seeds of how many stalks. No, you could go cut a reasonable amount. You could uproot a reasonable amount and bring it to your wife. And if there's extra, there's extra. Okay. Let's go weiter in the Shulchan Aruch. So we're back on the top line, Dalet Amud Beis. So that's one thing you're allowed to do. Continues the Mechaber. Velakar kishus. You're also allowed to harvest hops. Why would you harvest hops? Sheroi lahatel by sheichar l'tzarech hamayid. So the Chofetz Chaim changes the girsa over here. He says it should say lahatil b'sheichar, not lahatil by sheichar. You're allowed to harvest hops because you use hops to add it to beer. And therefore, that's also a tzarech hamayid. So you're allowed to go do the harvest of the hops, l'tzarech hamayid, for oichel nefesh. You're doing this on Chol HaMoed again. You're allowed to do it because there's a valid mayid purpose. Says the Chofetz Chaim, and he's cutting Yud Beis, Sheroy lahatil by sheichar. Tzarech loymar, what it should say over here is lahatil b'sheichar. It is usable to put it, to add it into beer. Shem arvin oisai b'sheichar. That would mix hops into beer, same as we do. Laseis by chorfa. And it gave the beer a little bit of a sharp acidic taste. The gambazeh imhu oisel tzarezeh. Of course, again, this is only mutter if that's why you're harvesting the hops. If you're harvesting the hops to put it into your beer for Yom Tov, then you're allowed to do it on Chol HaMoed. The gam rak b'chtei mashu tzarech lamayid. And again, you're only allowed to harvest what you're going to reasonably need for Yom Tov. You can't, if you're a beer maker, you can't say, okay, I have some time off on Chol HaMoed, I'm going to do my whole hops harvest. No, only what you need for the mayid. And this applies as well to the next halacha that we're going to learn. Let's go back up to the Mechaber, right by the Ois Yud Gimel for the Mishnah Berurah, the second line of the Shulchan Aruch. Velakar shumshimin. You're also allowed to harvest what we would generally translate as sesame, but we'll have to see the Mishnah Berurah. Velakar shumshimin. You're allowed to uproot shumshimin. Shahayaveshim shabai ru'uyim lechal miyad. Because although the moist kernels of this shumshimin are not roi for achila now, and they're not going to be roi la'achila during the moed, and therefore the harvesting of the moist shumshimin is not a tzarech hamayid, and therefore it should not be mutter on Chol HaMoed. However, when you do pick the shumshimin, there are going to be parts of the shumshimin that are already dry. And the dry shumshimin is royal achila right now. And therefore, you're allowed to pick all of this shumshimin so that you should be able to pick out the dry ones and eat the dry ones on the moed. Let's take a look at this inside in the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Katan Yud Gimel. Velakar shumshimin. You're allowed to pick and uproot the shumshimin. Says the Chofetz Chaim, Einoi shumshimin shalanu shehem ma'achal gomor. This is not the shumshimin that we generally speak about, which the Chofetz Chaim says is a meichel gomor. It's a food that's perfectly ready to be eaten right now. That type of shumshimin, the Mechaber doesn't have to tell me that it's mutter to uproot it on Chol HaMoed. If it's something which is readily edible as it is right now, of course you're allowed to go pick it. You're allowed to go pick an apple on Chol HaMoed. You want to eat an apple, there's an apple tree, you're allowed to pick an apple and eat an apple. Same thing, if the shumshimin is ready to be eaten as is, of course you're allowed to pick it. So what's the chiddush of the Mechaber over here? Explains the Chofetz Chaim, the shumshimin that we're discussing here is Elohum min zera. This is some type of a seed, she'oisin migarinav shemen, where they would use this seed to produce oil. Oy, metagnim oisam bidvash, or alternatively, they would take these seeds and they would fry them in honey, uru'uyim la'achila, and that would make them roy la'achila. Ve'enon ru'uyim l'chol zeh, elo b'shah shehen yaveshin. However, they're not usable either for oil or for frying in honey and eating unless they are already dry. Aval halachim, but the moist shumshimin seeds, tzarech lahachmishan ulayavshan. Before you could use them, you need to wither them and dry them out. V'loichazu ad la'achar hamoed, and these are not going to be usable until after the moed. So again, what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with a shumshimin crop where a lot of it is not going to be roy la'achila on the moed. If it's moist, it has to be prepared first. It has to be dried out. And therefore, it's not going to be roy la'achila on the moed. It's only the dry ones that are going to be roy la'achila b'moed. Still in all, the Mechaber said, you're allowed to go ahead and pick this shumshimin. And the Mechaber explained why. The Mechaber said, Shahayaveshim shabai, because the dry seeds that are amongst them, ru'uyim lechal miyad, those are right to be eaten immediately. Explains the Chavetz Chaim in Ois Katan Yodalid, Shahayaveshim shabai, umashma, the implication is, Deshari le'la'akar b'li berurah. The implication of the Mechaber is, again, what does the Mechaber say? The Mechaber says you are allowed to uproot shumshimin. Why? Because the dry ones amongst them are roy la'achila right away. He doesn't tell you you're allowed to uproot dry shumshimin because it's roy lechol miyad. He says you're allowed to uproot shumshimin. Why? Because the ones that are dry are roy lechol miyad. Says the Chavetz Chaim, the clear implication of the Mechaber is you're allowed to uproot all of the shumshimin. You don't have to go out into the field and select which ones are dry and which ones are moist and only uproot the dry ones. No, you want shumshimin for the moed, you want shumshimin l'tzarech hamoed, go out and pick shumshimin, b'harvacha, pick, a reasonable amount of shumshimin. And then you'll pick out the dry ones later. Like the Chavetz Chaim says, va'achakach yivrar, after you pick them, then you'll pick out haru'uyim la'achila u'l'shemen, the ones that are usable that you could eat now, or that you could use to produce oil now, l'tzarech hamoed. So it turns out you're going to be picking shumshimin that is not usable on the moed. So a certain amount of the shumshimin that you're going to uproot on Chol HaMoed, it's not really l'tzarech hamoed. You're not going to use it on the moed. You're only going to use the ones that are roy la'achila miyad on the moed. Still, you're allowed to pick them all and select out the good ones, the ready ones afterwards. It seems that the reason for this, again, is like what we saw earlier by the flaxseed for the cosmetics. Once you have a bona fide reason why you're going out and you're harvesting this shumshimin, l'tzarech hamoed, I want shumshimin l'tzarech hamoed. I want to produce shumshimin oil. I want to fry the dry ones in honey, and I want to eat them on the moed. So I have a bona fide tzarech hamoed reason why I'm going out to pick it. Now the chachamim are not matriach you to go make yourself meshuggah and stand out in the field and say, is this one dry? Should I uproot this one? These 5 I have to skip. I'll uproot that one. No, you could go uproot them in a normal way and then select out the ones that you could use now. Okay, now we go back to the Shulchan Aruch. Let's go to Sif Gimel. A little bit of a complicated Sif, this Sif. Says the Mechaber, Perois shenispashlu ktsas, fruits that are somewhat ripened, but they're not fully ripened yet. Perois shenispashlu ktsas, and therefore v'ne'echolin al yedei atchak. They are edible, but they're only edible al yedei atchak. Literally, it means in a pressing situation. They're not lechatchila. They're not really what you want to eat. But if you're very hungry and that's what's there, you'll eat it. Mutter lelaktan kidei la'achlan. You are allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to pick these to eat them on Yom Tov. What's the chiddush over here? So the Aruch HaShulchan words this in a very nice way. I wrote down the lashon here. The Aruch HaShulchan says, V'loyam rinan, we don't say she'ein derech b'nei adam lechel kain, that it's not the normal derech to eat these peros this way, and therefore maybe you shouldn't be allowed to pick it on Yom Tov. After all, you're only allowed to pick it on Chol HaMoed. I keep saying Yom Tov. Remember, we're learning here Hilchas Chol HaMoed. You're not allowed to pick peros on Yom Tov proper. We're talking about Chol HaMoed. You might think, yes, I'm allowed to pick an apple on Chol HaMoed to eat an apple on Chol HaMoed. That I understand. But if it's an apple that's not really ripe, so most people wouldn't eat it, maybe I'm not allowed to pick it on Chol HaMoed. Even if I want to eat it, maybe you say, Batal Daita, it's a Kol Adam. Maybe this is not really called a Meichel. It's not the Derech Achila Bekach, and maybe therefore I'm not allowed to pick it. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, that's the Chiddush of the Mechaber over here. We don't say that. Because there are people who do like it that way. There are people who like, I know in my household, there are people that like the bananas when the bananas are almost completely brown on the outside and they're nice and soft and sweet. And then I have people who like the bananas when they're still a little bit greenish. I wouldn't eat a banana that way. It's hard, it's not sweet, I have no interest in it. But I have kids that want to eat the banana that way. So there are people who eat unripened fruit. So if you want to pick fruit that's not fully ripened, now the language of the Mechaber was, Shenispashlu ktsas, it's at least somewhat ripened. If it's not ripened at all, then you're not allowed to pick it. That's taka, not the derech achila. But if it's at least somewhat ripened, some people like it less ripe, some people like it more ripe. So you're allowed to pick that on Chol HaMoed in order to eat it. Mutter l'laktan, you're allowed to pick it kedei la'achlan, in order to eat it. You're not allowed to pick it because you want to pick it now and put it away and let it get ripe for after Yom Tov. That you're not allowed to do. It has to be l'tzarech hamoed. But if you want to pick it now, to eat it now the way it is, go ahead. You're allowed to do that in Chol HaMoed. Continues the Mechaber. V'im liktan la'achlan. Now let's say you did pick these somewhat ripened fruits with having in mind that you were going to eat it. V'hoiser. And you ate some, but the rest are left over. V'choishish, and you're concerned, shema yasliu. Sometimes you have unripened fruit. There's different fruits and vegetables. Some only ripen on the tree or on the vine. Some will ripen even after you pick them. But there are some types of peros that if you pick them when they're not fully ripe, so if you eat it right away, fine, you eat it. If you don't eat it and you let it sit there, it'll get wormy. It'll go bad. So now, I picked a whole bunch of somewhat ripened peros in order to eat them on Chol HaMoed. I was allowed to do that. But, like we said, I'm not mechuyev to pick it b'tzimtzum. I don't have to say I'm picking one for me, one for my wife, and one for my daughter. So I could pick 3. No, I could go pick 6, 7, apples, and some people will eat, some people won't eat. So now I have leftover peros that are only partially ripe. And now I'm concerned that they're going to go li'ibud, they're going to go to waste. They're going to get wormy unless I salt them in order to preserve them. If I could put them in salt now, they'll become preserved and they won't get wormy. By salting them, we're talking about dry salt. I'm not talking about pickling. If you put it in dry salt, that extracts the moisture from the fruit, and now it won't become wormy, and it'll be preserved. Yachal lekavsham. You're allowed to go ahead and you're allowed to go preserve them. Now the chiddush over here is, this preservation that you're doing, this is not l'tzarech hamoed, because once you take the peros and you put them in salt, they're not going to be roy lachila now for several days. Once you start that salting and preserving process, first the fruits become not roy lachila because they're full of salt. When they become preserved and they become dried, then they will become roy la'achila again. But so what am I doing now? I'm doing a tircha. I'm doing some level of melachah that's not l'tzarech hamoed. Am I allowed to do that? So the answer is yes. Since you are allowed to pick them, because you picked them k'dei la'achlan, you picked them in order to eat them l'tzarech hamoed. Now you have them and you're afraid they're going to go to waste. That means it's a davar avud. If it's a davar avud, you're allowed to go ahead and salt them to preserve them, even though they're no longer going to be royal achila on the Yom Tov, and they're only going to be royal achila for after Yom Tov. Still, you're allowed to do this. Says the Mishnah Berurah, nice cotton tesvav. Yachal lekavsham, you're allowed to salt them. Ritzainer loymar, afal gav deshuv lo yehu ru'uyin l'chol yomais achag. Even though by salting them now, you're creating a situation where they're no longer going to be royal achila for the rest of Yom Tov. V'im kein tarach rak limeachol. So if so, it comes out that the tircha that you're doing now to salt them is a tircha that you're not doing l'tzarech hamoed. It's a tircha that you're doing l'tzarech achar hamoed. Still, you're allowed to do it. Afilu achishari. Nevertheless, this is mutar. Why? Devi davar ha'avud. Because since you're afraid that these fruits are going to go li'ibud, they're going to go to waste, so that means you're going to take a hit. You're losing money. These fruits are going to go to waste. For a davar ha'avud, you're allowed to do this melachah. You're allowed to do this tercha. You could go ahead and you could salt them. Now continues the mechaber. By me, it's 4 lines down near the end of the line. So far, what did we say? So far, we said, you had these peiros that were somewhat ripened. You're allowed to pick them to eat them on Chol HaMoed. You picked a bunch of them. You ate some. You had some left over. If you leave them alone, they're going to go to waste. You want to salt them, so you want to do a tircha to preserve them for after Yom Tov. You're allowed to do that. Even though it's a terka la'achar hamoed, you're allowed to do it because it's a davar ha'avud. Continues the mechaber. Aval, however, asar lelaktam tchila kedei lechavsham. What you are not allowed to do is, you're not allowed to go pick them on Yom Tov, not to eat them. You don't want to eat them. Maybe I don't like these only partially ripened fruits. But I want to pick them on Chol HaMoed to salt them and pickle them and preserve them for after Yom Tov. I saw my neighbor, he picked 5 of these fruits, he ate 3 of them, and he salted the other 2. You know what? Sounds like a great idea, but I don't want to eat 3 of them now. I only want to pick them now and salt them for after the Moed. That you're not allowed to do. You want to pick them initially to salt them for after Yom Tov. No, that you can't do. Now, why can't you do that? The reason you can't do that is because now you're doing the melachah of kotzer. You're picking them. That's a melachah gemurah. That's a full-fledged, bona fide melachah. You're not allowed to do melachah al Chol HaMoed for a tzorich for achar hamoed. There's no tzorich hamoed here. You're not eating them on Yom Tov. You're not preserving them for Yom Tov. You only want to pick them now to preserve them for after Yom Tov. You can't do the melachah gemurah of kotzer for a tzorich for achar hamoed. Can't do that. And before we go weiter, I just want to point out to you, take a look at the Bir Halacha Dibur HaMaschil, Asar Lalaktam Tchila Kedei Lekavsham. Ayin b'Magen Avram, Shekasav, take a look at the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram writes, the Kavanas al Shulchan Aruch Hu, that the intent of the Mechaber over here is, Afilu lo yimtza achar hamoed. This is true, even if it's something that will not be available to you la'achar hamoed. Let's say you're on a Chol HaMoed trip, and they're available here, but when I go back home after Yom Tov, these fruits aren't going to be available. Or maybe I know that all of these fruits are going to be picked out. Other people are going to pick all the fruits. There's going to be none left after the Moed. And I love these dried fruits. So I want to pick it now on Chol HaMoed in order to salt it and preserve it for after Yom Tov. No, you're still not allowed to do it. Why? The likatu melachah gemurah, because the picking of the fruit is a melachah gemurah. Ve'ena muteres ela b'davar ha'avud. When the Mechaber said that you're allowed to salt the fruits when you had leftovers, that was because it was a davar ha'avud, because I already have the fruits and they're going to go to waste. But this is not a davar ha'avud. Now you want to make an argument, it's a davar ha'avud because after Yom Tov I'm not going to be able to get it. That's not a davar ha'avud. That's not I have something and I'm going to lose it. It's not I have money and I'm going to lose money, or I have something worth money that's going to become worthless. It's meniah es harevach. I want to get something. I could get it now. I can't get it then. You can't do a melachah gemurah of likita in order to protect yourself, in order to get something now that I won't be able to get then. That's not called a pseida. That's not called a davar ha'avad. Okay, now let's go weiter in the Shulchan Aruch. Right by the Ois Cotton Tez Zayin, 3 lines up from the bottom, near the beginning of the line. Now again, let's say we're talking about something that you're not going to be able to get after the moed. So you have a merchant is over here on Chol HaMoed, and he has fruits of this type that you like to preserve. You like to dry them for after Yom Tov. Okay, so I want to buy them now on Chol HaMoed. I don't want to pick them. I'm not picking them. I'm just purchasing them. I want to purchase these fruits now on Chol HaMoed in order to preserve them on Chol HaMoed for use after the moed. Says the Mechaber, if it's a type of fruit that you're not going to be able to acquire after the moed, mutter l'knoisai or l'kavshai, then you're allowed to purchase it on Chol HaMoed and you're allowed to preserve it on Chol HaMoed. Why? I think the explanation of this is because what are you doing here? What you're doing is you're making a purchase, that's kiniyah, and you're doing kvisha, and you're doing preserving. You're preserving something. Neither one of those are considered a melachah gemura. It's not like likita. Likita is one of the lamites malachas. It's not likita, picking or harvesting, which is a bona fide malacha. It's kiniyah. Kiniyah is mekachu memkar, buying something. And kvisha, preserving something. These are not melachos gemuros. So you want to do something on Chol HaMoed, which is not a melacha gemura, and you want to do it for meniah es harevach. You want to do it because if I don't do it now, I'm not going to be able to acquire this fruit. I could only acquire the fruit now. So if I don't buy it now on Chol HaMoed, I'm going to lose the opportunity to buy it. And once I buy it, if I don't preserve it on Chol HaMoed, it's going to go bad. So then you're allowed to buy it and you're allowed to preserve it on Chol HaMoed. So very interesting. That's why I said this sif is a little bit complicated. If we run through all the halachas that Mechaber just told me now with these fruits, it comes out that the Mechaber said like this. If you have partially ripened fruits on the tree and you want to pick them to eat them in that condition, in that partially ripened condition on Chol HaMoed, you're allowed to do that. Because you're doing likita, you're doing the melachah of kotzer, you're harvesting something, which is a melachah gemura, but you're doing it l'tzarech hamoed. And even though it's only a partially ripened fruit, some people like to eat the fruits that way. So no problem. You're doing a malacha l'tzarech hamoed, and it's even l'tzarech eichel nefesh. So the Mechaber said, fine, you could go ahead, you could pick them. When you pick them, you're not mechuyev to be mitzamtzim. You don't have to pick exactly what you need. You could pick a bunch. So you picked a bunch. Now you have some left over. The leftover ones, if you don't preserve them, they're going to go bad. Said the Mechaber, you could preserve them. Why? Because it's a davar ha'avad. If you don't preserve them, you're going to take a loss. They're going to get ruined. So, because it's a davar ha'avad, you're allowed to go ahead and preserve them. Oh, I'm allowed to preserve them. Does that mean I'm allowed to go and initially pick them to preserve them? No, you're not allowed to do that. Why? Because now you're doing the melachah of kotzer, which is a melachah gemura. You're going to pick it off the tree. You're doing a melachah gemura l'tzarech achar hamoed. That's not a tzarech hamoed. You're doing it for after the moed. That you're not allowed to do. You're not allowed to do a melachah gemura for a tzarech of achar hamoed. So to initially pick them to preserve them, you're not allowed to do. Okay, next case. How about if a merchant comes and he's selling these types of fruits and I want to buy them on Chol HaMoed and preserve them on Chol HaMoed to eat them after Yom Tov? Yes, that you're allowed to do. Because now you're not doing a malacha gemura for a tzarech achar hamoed. Now you're only doing a shvacha malacha. Now you're only doing kiniyah and kivisha for achar hamoed. That you're allowed to do. Now let's see this inside in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah in Ois Cotton Tez Zayin. Ve'imuhu davar she'enoi nimtza. If it's a fruit that's not going to be available to you after the moed, v'hu adinim is yakar achakach. Or maybe it will be available after Chol HaMoed, but after Chol HaMoed, after Yom Tov, it's going to go up significantly in price. Ukemoi b'pragmatya l'kamon siman tov kuf lamed tes sif hey. This halacha is similar to the halacha of doing business that we're going to see later on in Siman Tov Kuf Lamed Tes in Sif Hey. Over there, the Mechaber says you're not allowed to do pragmatia. You're not allowed to do business on Chol HaMoed. Why? Because it's a tircha. It's an inappropriate tircha. It's a zilzul of Yom Tov to do pragmatia on Chol HaMoed. But if you want to buy something on Chol HaMoed in order to do business with it, you have the ability to buy something now in Chol HaMoed and you want to resell it after Yom Tov. And if I don't buy it now in Chol HaMoed, I'm not going to be able to buy it after Yom Tov. So I'm going to lose this business opportunity. So again, it's like a meniah es harevach. You're allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed. It's not a melachah gemura. It's only something which is also because of inappropriate tircha. So for meniah es harevach, in order to not lose the opportunity, you're allowed to do that on Chol HaMoed. And that's similar to what we're talking about over here. If you want to buy these fruits on Chol HaMoed to preserve them on Chol HaMoed because they're not going to be available after Yom Tov, you could do it. Even though they're not going to be usable on Yom Tov, because once you salt them, they're not going to be edible on Yom Tov. And the reason this is mutter is because again we compare this to the halacha of doing business, the shari b'kahai gavna, which is mutter in such a case. And then the Mishnah Berurah tells you to look at a lengthy Mishnah Berurah, a lengthy bir halacha here. Not everybody agrees with this. Okay, so that was a little bit of a complicated sif. Let's go on to the next sif. Let's do sif daled. 2 lines from the bottom in the Shulchan Aruch. Says the Mechaber, Tzad Adam Dogim, you're allowed to go trap fish. You could go fishing. Kol ma sheyachol lotzud, whatever you could trap. You're not mechuyev to say, what do I need? 2 fish, 3 fish, 5 fish. So okay, so I'll go fishing and I'll catch berevach. I'll catch 8 fish. But I have to stop there because the rest is not tzarech hamayid. Says the Mechaber, no. You could trap, you could fish however much you can get. Umayleach hakol b'mayid. And you could salt it all. You could salt all of that fish on Chol HaMoed. Why? Shaharei efshar shayochal mehem b'mayid. Because it's possible to eat any of it on Yom Tov. What the Mechaber is telling me, I'll tell you the gist of it outside before we see it in the Mishnah Berurah to make it simple. We said by, let's say, flour. If you need to grind grain into flour on Chol HaMoed for the use of Yom Tov, you're allowed to. And you're not mechuyev to be mitzamtzim, but you're also not allowed to do all of your flour grinding on Chol HaMoed. You're allowed to grind l'tzarech hamayid. By fish, we also said that by salting, give me 1 second. Yeah, we said by the fruits that you're not allowed to pick the fruits in order to salt them and preserve them. But over here by fish, we're saying an interesting thing. By fish, we're saying you could catch as much fish as you want, and you could salt as much fish as you want. Now, how come we're not worried that you're catching fish that's not l'tzarech hamayid? You're catching a tremendous amount of fish, it's not l'tzarech hamayid. The answer to that is going to be, the Mishnah Berurah is going to say, every fish is different. Every fish tastes different. Every fish is a different size. So if you catch 30 fish, it might be the 30th fish that you'll use for Yom Tov. Maybe the biggest, fattest fish will be the 30th fish that you catch. So that's a covered Yom Tov. You're going to use that one for Yom Tov. And the fact that you're going to salt them all on Yom Tov, on Chol HaMoed, why don't we say you can't salt them all on Chol HaMoed? Because once you salt them, they're no longer usable on Chol HaMoed, and now it's not tzarech hamayid. The answer is because by fish, different than fruit, once you salt them, they become inedible for several days. But fish, even if you salt it, if you change your mind and you decide you want to eat it, the way the Mechaber says, apparently, you could squeeze it. And that will soften up the fish and extract some of the salt, I believe. And then it will become edible even on Yom Tov. So you never know. You might use any of this fish on Yom Tov. Let's see this inside in the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in Yud Ches. Kol ma'ashe yachal lotzud. You could trap and fish as much fish as you can. Mashma, the implication is, even if it's obvious that you're catching an abundance of fish way and beyond what you could possibly use on Yom Tov, it's still mutter. This is not similar to the flour that we saw in Sif Aleph, that you're only allowed to grind what you could reasonably expect to use on Yom Tov, where you're only allowed to do what you need in a generous amount. Shani hacha, by fish it's different. Shein kol dog shava b'taimai. Not every fish tastes the same. Val kol tzeda, and on each fish that you trap, yesh loymar shema yimtza b'shubachim b'yosevu kavod Yom Tov. I might find a better one. Maybe the next fish I'll catch will be a nicer fish, and I'll use that one for Yom Tov, and that's a bigger kavod Yom Tov. Ice cut in your test, umayleach hakol b'mayid. You could salt all the fish that you catch on Chol HaMoed. Ritzayin loymar. In this, the Mechaber wants to tell us a chiddush. The loydami l'sif gimel. It's not similar to the halacha that we saw in Sif Gimel by the fruit. The loy shari lalaktam k'dei l'kavsham, where we said you're not allowed to pick the fruit initially in order to salt it and preserve it for after Yom Tov. So why don't we say the same thing here? You're catching such an abundance of fish, and now you're salting such an abundance of fish. Obviously, a lot of this fish that you're salting is only for use for after Yom Tov. Explains the Mishnah Berurah, no. Hasam shani, by the fruit it's different. Because once you salt them, they become inedible for X amount of days. So it turns out that the salting that you're doing is a tercha that's obviously only l'tzarech achar hamoed, because on the moed it's no longer going to be royal achila. But that's not the case by fish. Because because by fish, you can, under pressing circumstances, squeeze out the fish and eat them. So it turns out, maybe you will eat it on Yom Tov. So then the tircha that I'm doing is not only for after Yom Tov. There's a very interesting footnote here. Dirshu footnote number 20. How about going fishing for a Chol HaMoed trip? Are you allowed to go fishing on Yom Tov, not to eat the fish? Catch and release. I have no intention in eating the fish at all. I'm just going on a trip. Some people enjoy fishing. So can I go fishing? I always said I would enjoy fishing the most if I could go fishing without the string and without the hook. What do I mean? You see people that are fishing. I go out to the fishing pier here sometime here on Staten Island on Sharet, and I see the fishermen. They have 5 rods. They cast. They stick the rod into a holder. They lean back. They light up a cigar or a pipe, and they have a paper, or they have a book, and they sit down and they relax. So sometimes I say to myself, yeah, I want to go fishing. I'll cast, and then I'll take out a sefer, and I'll lean back, and I'll sit and I'll learn. Mamish, ruig. It's so relaxing. But the problem is, what if I catch a fish? If I catch a fish, then I got to reel it in, and I got to take it off the hook, and I got to figure out what to do with it. Who needs that? All I want to do is I just want to have the rod so I could put the rod over there so anybody who looks at me doesn't think I'm a Meshuggah. They say, oh, I'm fishing. Okay, so I'm also fishing. You can't see the string. Okay, it's hard to see fishing line. But don't give me, or at least just give me string and a weight, but not a hook. I don't want to chas v'shalom catch a fish. Then I'm going to be busy with the fish. So anyway, so are you allowed to go fishing on Yom Tov just for enjoyment? So in Dirshu footnote number 20 here it says, Ule'inyan adam hadog dogim l'tainug ba'alma. Somebody who's going fishing just for enjoyment. Ve'enim iskaven loichlam, and he has no intent to eat the fish. Das ha'goyin Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach zatzal, v'ha'goyin Rav Shmuel Vosner zatzal, she'aser l'tzudam, they hold that it's aser, af im misanig b'tzeidasam. Even if you're enjoying the fishing, they say this is not a tzarech Yom Tov, this is melachah shaloi l'tzarech Yom Tov, and you're not allowed to do this on Chol HaMoed. V'chein das ha'shal s'tshuvas ber Moshe. The Debritzina held the same way. May Idach, on the other hand, das ha'goyin Rav Moshe Feinstein, and this is not brought down from the Igris. I don't recall seeing this. They bring this down from the Shmir Shabbos Kilchasa and from something called Sefer HaZikaron Bevakshe Torah Chol HaMoed. I don't know what this is. Shemutu loy l'tzayda b'moed, that you're allowed to go fishing on Chol HaMoed. Shekevin shemisanig b'tzeidasam, because since this is a tainug, since this is something enjoyable, zeu tzarech HaMoed. That's called tzarech HaMoed. But uladaita adiv shemikamakam yochel mehem. But that the Rishiva Zatzal does say that it would be better if you would eat some of the fish on Yom Tov and enjoy it on Yom Tov. That way the fishing was a tzarech HaMoed. Okay, I guess we'll stop over here with the words of the Ramah. So we're going to stop on the bottom line of Dalan Amud Beis. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should stand Gans Klal Yisrael in good stead. And the schus of the limud HaTorah, the Rebbeinu Shalom should send the refuah shaleva to Mental Shmuel ben Miriam Leah, Yitzchak ben Chana Rachel, Menachem Arya ben Dina Yehudis, Yisrael Menachem ben Ita Genendel, B'sayich Shar Chel Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should be Megan and Gans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbeinu Shalom should return us to a time of simcha. We should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek b'Meher v'Yameinu. Be well.